Hey, everybody, and welcome back to our study group discussing the history of philosophy without any gaps by Peter Adamson. Today with me, Rogério Marques and Gram Pong. Hi, guys.
Hi, man. Nice to be
Hello.
here.
Yeah, today we're discussing episodes 18 to 23, and man, we have a lot of dialogues we're going to go through. So we're going to be discussing the Euthyphro, the Charmides, the Euthydemus, the Gorgias, the Meno, and the Theaetetus. It's going to be it's going to be a wild one. It's mostly Plato and Socrates, though, so not, a, not so much focused on a long list of philosophers this time.
Yeah, despite not being a lot of people, it involves a lot of characters and their adventures. So today we will be talking about Plato by Socrates, Socrates by Plato, but without the theory of forms. In the previous episode, we talked about at the very start about Socrates without Plato, and then Socrates with Plato a bit, and now Socrates as a character by Plato without involving any of the theory of the forms, which is we will be doing in the next episode. But to give a little bit of context with visual aids, so we're back to Greece, Mediterranean, and focused especially and only on Athens. This is where all the action happens, because Socrates is a true Athenian. He as a character and as a historical figure, although he battled in the Peloponnesian War. Other than that, he doesn't seem to have traveled much. And so he's all the action, all the dramatic action in the Platonic dialogues, where Socrates is the main character, happen in Athens. And so today I present you the dialectic adventures of Socrates. Dialectic because he uses the Socratic method, which is it's called the dialectic, especially involving questions. And the picture that Peter Adamson wanted us to have was of Socrates walking around, accompanied by especially young men in the Athenian marketplace, hanging around, debating ideas all day long, probably. Probably they had a blast. But this, of course, meant that many young men started to get the techniques from Socrates, and they, as young men usually are, they like to provoke and to find loopholes and find errors in thinking of older men. And so eventually, even indirectly, this started to ruffle some feathers in Athens, of course. It's also useful to get a grip of where did this Socrates guy draw from? What were his intellectual influences and intellectual predecessors? Most of them, by virtue of our previous episodes, fortunately, they are no longer known names to us, and we can start making connections between them and Socrates and among them in our minds. So Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes from the school of Miletus, and the Pythagoreans to the right in orange. Then we have independent thinkers like Heraclitus, and Socrates himself is considered an independent thinker. Then the Eleatics, represented in yellow, Parmenides, Xenophanes, Melissus, Zeno of Elea, to not confuse with the others, guys called Zeno. The pluralists or atomists, the pluralists that mix, or syncretic guys that mix a lot of ideas, the atomists, Democritus and Leucippus, and the sophists they are all in a jumbled mess in the middle, where seemingly they belong, and they affected the Athenian society quite a lot, as commented by Plato, and not only Plato. And so there we have Socrates as a likely student of Anaxagoras, but he also learned from if I'm not mistaken, Prodicus at one time. And so, yeah, this is the context for our Platonic dialogues. Before we go to the timeline where we can see Socrates and Plato's life in one, do you guys want to intervene here?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's an interesting point about Prodicus. I think it's more speculative whether Prodicus had a direct influence on Socrates, but they shared like a priority for defining terms clearly. So it may have been that influence was either direct or indirect. May have just been generally in rhetoric considered, taught that the definitions of words are quite important. Or it may have been influenced by something like the geometry that was being taught to the Greeks, where sort of definitions also play a really important role in the proofs that are being derived. But yeah, so they share this kind of obsession with clear definitions, Socrates and Prodicus. Whether Socrates was directly influenced by Prodicus is more speculative.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say I really like the org chart. This it does help put a good visual, especially with the colors, on a lot of what we've been talking about. No, I was going to say I do like that all the sophists are sort of in a gang together arguing with themselves. That's sort of appropriate. So, tagging out.
Yeah, and for sure they were competing among themselves and also competing with so-called philosophers like Socrates. As for Plato, Socrates obviously most well-known student. So he supposedly met his mentor Socrates at when he was a young adult. Plato seems to be highly syncretic as a thinker as well. Obviously, he was influenced by Socrates. Maybe he spent about 10 years with Socrates since he met him until Socrates was put to death. But Plato was also interested in Heraclitus and Parmenides. Pythagoras probably was also an influence. He ended up founding his own school in a grove in the outskirts of Athens called the Academia, from which the word academy comes from. So Plato was original. Everyone else copied, maybe most without knowing. And the name was based on a Greek hero called Hecademus. There were many pursuits in the academia, philosophical pursuits, dialectical reasoning, argument, classification and division, of which Plato's student Aristotle was really big on, and mathematics. His real name, it might come as a shock, was Aristocles. And I put it side by side with really close to the name of his most famous student, Aristotle. And fortunately, someone had the sense to call Plato with this nickname, Plato. We discussed it in the previous session, so anyone can review. After Socrates died, he traveled more or less during 20 years. So even in the ancient technology of travel, 20 years is quite a long time to travel throughout the Greek world, including Egypt, Italy, Syracuse, and Sicily generally. And he left us 25 to 30 dialogues. There are still discussions about the veracity or authorship of some of them. And the most ambitious one, the biggest one, is the Republic. And so, yeah, this is Plato, the author of the dialogues in a nutshell. He also didn't supposedly write anything in his own voice. He was completely adherent to only writing in dialogue form.
Yeah, just I think we did cover this in a previous episode, but a point about his nickname. I think it's derived from, is it Platus? Platus, which means
Platus,
broad.
yeah, broad.
Platus. which I could have referred to him having a broad build as a wrestler, or maybe having a broad forehead.
Or yeah, exactly. Or possessing broad knowledge. So the jury is out on this one. The guy that commented on Plato's life, Diogenes Laertius, in his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, often he gave different competing accounts on the life of these thinkers he was reporting on. And in Plato's case, he has these three possible explanations for Plato's nickname.
Yeah. I use Nerdalliun as a nickname for myself, so I kind of wondered whether Plato might have used a pseudonym for himself, just to author stuff under like a pen name.
Yeah. Graham, how are you feeling about this Life of Plato?
Well, I was going to say he had a very interesting life. Again, he was a wrestler in the Olympics, and the one thing that stands out here is the 20-year gap after Socrates' death. It's like part of the motivation for his dialogues was to, after 20 years, you're going to have a whole new generation that didn't know Socrates, and he's basically trying to give Socrates, give his mentor to the new generation in Athens, and that definitely coincided with Socrates' attraction to young men.
Yeah, you put a kind of, you made a question emerge in my mind with your account right now, which is these 20 years Plato spent out of Athens immediately after Socrates was put to death. Probably the elite of Athens didn't just limit to sentence and carry out the sentence on Socrates' life, but probably they also engaged in suppression of the ideas that Socrates promoted among the youth. And maybe it made Plato's project way more necessary in Plato's perspective.
Definitely. The other one I would add is that's missing on this list is Plato's time as a playwright.
Yeah.
And that's something that, as going through the dialogues, became more and more apparent to me, is just his writing skill is every bit as good as his philosophizing. Going to tag on that one. I'm sure we'll discuss more on that.
Yeah. Yeah, since this slide is more or less the repetition from the previous episode, I didn't want to repeat exactly all the things. But yeah, for sure, his life before Socrates was as a playwright. And there's even the story that he burnt all his literary productions after meeting Socrates, kind of showcasing the utter shock that he received when he met Socrates and started to realize Socrates' ideas and become influenced by them. I also found out a really curious thing about the place where I studied. So I studied in the University of Coimbra here in Portugal, and the facade of the mathematics department has Plato here down to the left, with the Pythagorean theorem as well. And above Plato's head, I never noticed it, but are these words, and they say basically, let no one inept in geometry come in. And these were exactly the same words that were supposedly in the entrance to Plato's academy. So I thought this really curious thing. That Peter Adamson mentioned this. I searched for these exact Greek characters on Google, and my university popped up. So things come around. And then regarding the jumble of events that happened during Socrates' life and also Plato's life, I have this nifty timeline. So mostly below and in blue, the dates in blue are dates of things that supposedly really happened. And the in red, the dates are the dramatic dates that the scholars studying the Platonic dialogues believe these dialogues report on events occurring. For instance, the Parmenides, which is not one of the first dialogues written, the dramatic action of the Parmenides is supposedly situated in 450 BCE, which was when Socrates was a young adult, and Socrates supposedly had a dialogue with Parmenides. Well, it could be completely fictitious, but if the timelines would need to be correct, considering Parmenides' date of birth and death, and Socrates as well, it would need to be situated more or less in 450. And then moving on, we have the events of other dialogues, the Socrates' encounter with Protagoras, then later on the Gorgias and with Thrasymachus in the Republic Book 1. Also, Socrates muses about virtues such as temperance in the Charmides or courage in the Laches later on. And moving on, then there are way more events in 399 BCE, which is a really a milestone year, because this is the year when Socrates is actually charged of corrupting the youth and impiety, and when he is arrested and sentenced to death, and when he actually dies. And Plato wrote a bunch of dialogues even between him being sentenced, the sentence being officialized in the court, and until his moment of death. There are a few of these dialogues, like the Euthyphro, the Apology, which reports on the actual court affairs, and the Phaedo, which is basically the last day of Socrates. And then after Socrates, there are as we've mentioned, Plato's travels during more or less 20 years, where he was in Egypt and Syracuse and whatnot. Also, there are the trips to Syracuse by Plato in 380, 367, and 361, when Plato tried to put his philosophy into practice by affecting the politics of Syracuse in the individual of the tyrant that was ruling Syracuse, either Dionysius or his son, which was also called Dionysius. Also, the Xenophon's memoirs or Xenophon's memorabilia was written solid 20-something years after Socrates' death. And so everything that is written about Socrates was written with a few years of remove from Socrates' life. And then below the timeline, we have the Socratic dialogues. We have the division of the Platonic dialogues in Socratic dialogues, middle dialogues, and late dialogues, which is the more or less agreed upon by the scholars nowadays in regards to how the dialogues are divided. So the Socratic dialogues are likely the dialogues that represent more faithful Socrates, more realistic Socrates, but this is of course subject to discussion because, for instance, Peter Adamson doesn't believe at all that the Socratic dialogue Socrates is real at all. He thinks Plato started with Socrates as a mouthpiece from day one. Well, it is possible. But then we have middle dialogues and later dialogues where Socrates starts to go into the forms and whatnot way more, and that's that. So this is the life of Socrates and Plato side by side in a nutshell. And I wonder what you guys think about this.
it's very interesting, but there's more than I'm going to remember. I think Peter Adamson said if you want to remember one day 399 BCE is a good date to remember, and I figured, yeah, and it's also easy enough to remember one day. So I think from all of that, that's probably what I'll remember. But it's nice seeing it like that. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, I think it's great to see basically the chronological, at least as far as the time events happen of when Plato's dialogues were. That helps put things into perspective. One thing that I think may be off there is when Plato met Socrates, because most of the dates for Plato's birth is about 427 BC. 427, 428 is about as early as he is. If you met him at 20, it'd be closer to like 410 when they met. So other than that, just a little, factual point. But other than that, I think it's a fabulous graph. It helps, again, like the org chart, helps put things into a visual sense that you don't have elsewhere. And I'm the same with Nerdalliun. You're not going to be able. I'm not going to be able to tell you later what your ion was written. So,
Yeah.
But great reference. Thanks. Tag.
Yeah, actually, this was started way before even Nerdalliun challenged me for this. I just adapted it and filled in some blanks, especially with the travels that weren't yet included. And I kind of did this just by myself because I was wrestling with the complexity. I was seeing so many dialogues, and I was having a hard time putting them into perspective and realizing what kind of context these dialogues had. For someone that just approaches Plato and his work for the first time, complexity and perplexity will surely happen, and this basically necessity is the mother of invention, and I had to create this thing because I wanted to understand Plato so hard. That's basically it. And as for the Socratic middle and late dialogues, how scholars nowadays divide things, so they are divided more or less like this. So the first dialogues, as I've mentioned, probably represent a more historically similar Socrates, and the later ones, middle and later ones, are way probably more Plato using Socrates as a mouthpiece. What else could be said about these dialogues? So the Socratic dialogues are said to be highly focused, seem to match more closely Xenophon's account of Socrates, and the middle dialogues are more didactic, and they include the Republic. And as they are more didactic, they are probably more artificial. And the late dialogues are written are more technical, and they are less literary. And maybe this was because as Plato was already an elderly man while writing these dialogues, he was less patient. He knew he probably had little time to write these, and so even, for instance, the laws is probably Plato died before finishing the laws. It's half done, and so yeah, that's the reasoning that I managed to compile that explains this division in three parts of the Socratic dialogues.
It may be I don't know what the reason might be for going more literary to more technical. But one of the reasons may be he did begin life as a playwright. And so as a younger man, that sort of history of trying to become a playwright would have been more recent. And then after Socrates' death, he had that period of travels. And then after the period of travels, he did start an academy where people were doing like scholarly kinds of things. And maybe in that scholarly pursuits, his mind, he began to think more like scholars think. So less like a playwright might think, and more like a scholar, so more didactic, teaching people how the way things are rather than writing amusing and entertaining and thought-provoking and sort of grabbing tales.
Also, he might have become kind of jaded due to the travels to Syracuse, and it shows in his later dialogues. He is less patient.
Another thing that jumps out to me is some of it could be just his maturation as a writer as well, where he got into more of an abstract, refined writing style. Because when you were talking about the laws, which I've never really dove into the dialogue, is the idea that he could be making the meta point of the laws never finish. And he started incorporating more of that experimental writing style that we recognize today into his writing. Because I know he has like his account of Atlantis in I think it was in Critias. He ends right in the middle of it, and people talk about how we've lost the rest of it. And I've always wondered, maybe that's exactly how Plato intended it to end. Sort of James Joyce-like. So tagging on that.
Interesting idea. I guess we'll never know what Plato intended.
Yeah. There's this journalist nowadays called Graham Hancock, and he published a documentary reporting about ancient sites. One of those sites is in current-day Indonesia. And supposedly, when that site was active and humans were there, sea levels were a bit lower due to the glaciation. And there probably was more of a continent where Indonesia is now. And so who knows? Maybe it might have something to do with this kind of lost continent that got submerged or something like that. We cannot say for sure. More archaeology is needed, serious and really archaeology without any presuppositions, and open-minded archaeology. And because we know things about the past, like we think we know things about Socrates, but do we know them? We kind of get a second-hand account from Plato, which was then second-handed further by the medieval scholars and whatnot, and etc. So we are trying to interact with this individual Socrates with several degrees of remove, and so this hints at us that we must have intellectual humility of at least regarding Socrates, not to not think that we know for sure. Maybe this is even a higher meta lesson of all these things that happened to us. So at least regarding Socrates, we must show intellectual humility. And then we can broaden this intellectual humility to more things, because we are always at least a degree of remove from everything we interact with through our senses.
Yeah, I think intellectual humility is a good thing to cultivate and to exercise. But I kind of like the point Peter Adamson makes, where he says he doesn't think he has an ability to get to know the real historical Socrates. He doesn't really care for him. Socrates is a character in Plato that's really interesting as a character in Plato, and so he's happy to study the character that Plato talks about.
No, definitely, it's sort of we're looking at the past through the glass darkly. And we kind of have to take our point on Socrates from Socrates himself. Ultimately, we know nothing about Socrates, just what other people have told us about him. Tag it.
Also, as mentioned previously, we will be looking at a few dialogues. We will also look at, besides the Charmides, Gorgias, Meno, Euthydemus, Theaetetus, we will also look briefly at Euthyphro as well. Since Peter Adamson also mentioned it briefly in his introductory episode on Plato's life. And so, besides that, Peter Adamson made a nice comparison between Letter 7, which is one of the last things Plato supposedly wrote, and Phaedrus. So in Phaedrus, Plato says that written words cannot explain or defend themselves the way we can explain and defend ourselves in conversation. And then this is expounded and still in the Phaedrus, which was written before letter 7, mind you. Spoken words in dialect can help themselves and him who planted them, because he is present, and are not unfruitful, but have in them a seed which others brought up in different soils render immortal, making the possessors of it happy to the utmost extent of human happiness. Kind of alluding to the intellectual satisfaction being a higher form of happiness as well, which is something that we will delve into when we talk about the Epicureans. And in letter 7, I hope we will get there. If providence allows us, God's allowing, or logos permitting. In the 7th letter, which is under discussion whether it is a forgery or was written by Plato, but at least it has something similar to what Plato wrote in the Phaedrus. Words are distant echoes or images of true reality, so that it is impossible to capture reality perfectly in language. Still worse is putting one's thoughts into writing rather than live speech, since the written words will inevitably be vulnerable to distortion and misunderstanding. And so, kind of alluding to this meta narrative of looking at the words from the past with the translation, with the transcription during centuries and possible mistakes in transcription. And also the possibilities of forgeries, and also the likelihood that some material was lost that was maybe relevant to interpretation. And so here we are, stuck 2.5 millennia after, wondering about these pieces of writing.
Yeah, it's been an interesting idea to me, the contrast between spoken speech and written speech. They seem to have different strengths and weaknesses. I'm not so sure I'd go down strongly on either side. But like, obviously, if people only ever spoke, it would be much more difficult for traditions to build on top of each other over hundreds and thousands of years, because written words can survive that longer. Spoken words not so easily, and so they're subject to distortion across generations. But I think written words subject to less distortion than a retelling, which every time it's retold, it's told with variation. So I think the variation introduced by retelling would be greater than by rewriting. But things are lost in writing, like tone and prosody generally. So rhythm, which gives very important hints as to the attitude of the person speaking it. Like, person may be making an ironic point that's really obvious when they say the point out loud, but when it's written on a page, it may be really unclear whether they're being serious or ironic. And whether they're serious or ironic may actually have quite important consequences for the interpretation of the rest of the text. And just another point, like misunderstanding is completely possible among people who are speaking live, like any presidential debate. You see people sort of speaking past one each other and not understanding each other and misrepresenting each other and misunderstanding each other. So the mere fact of speaking, I don't think protects necessarily against misunderstanding. And so like in speaking and also in writing, it depends on the attitude and the work being put in by the listener or the reader. If they're doing sincere work to try to understand, they'll probably get a better understanding than when they have a different agenda and they just sort of surface. They're listening or not listening or reading at all, just looking for things to shoot down, looking for things to counter, which is independent of whether it's spoken or written. But yeah, the point that a person making an argument live can interact, so people can ask questions and they can clarify, and that back and forth can be very valuable. And people don't have that back and forth with a book. They can't have that back and forth with a teacher. That's why tutors are often much more productive ways for students to learn than just textbooks. So yeah, that's a definite one of the advantages of spoken words.
No, I was going to tag in here and talk about some of what they're talking about is the whole map versus territory, condensation, where any sort of word is only going to basically be like a cover over top of what they're trying to talk about. And for me, what I see is it's the difference between the spoken word versus the written word. The written word is static. It is what it is. And it's basically a one-way transmission where you're putting that out there and everybody's going to take away what they, what they can interpret from it. And they're going to be able to do that on their own time. They can read part of it. They can go back and read it at another point in time. They can stop and savor it, as opposed to conversation, which is within time. You can't like time out the conversation and come back or rewind it and such. And that's much more flow, and the interaction between the two people is the key there, because it also allows for the correction, the more precise transmission of exactly what the sender wants. So it's easier to send a specific message that way, as opposed to deliver the specific words. And those are what I see as both the strengths and weaknesses, as Nerdalliun was pointing out. Both of them have their pluses and their minuses. It all depends on which one is best. So tagging on that.
I would also like to share with you guys an interpretation of this problem, which is when we are talking about language and concepts, we are essentially talking about metaphysics, so ideas that are in our minds. And it's partly or fully symbolic, I'm not sure. Truth is likely not symbolic, how the world really is, nor can it be symbolically represented isomorphically with language. And by isomorphically, this is exactly the overlapping of our map, the map that we constructed for the reality, and its overlap with knowledge. If it completely overlaps and neatly overlaps, in an ideal situation, we would have what is true knowledge, or we would be wise, or we would have absolute knowledge. But as things turn out, our metaphysics of the world is never an accurate representation of the world, nor can it be, because we don't have the inner complexity to generate the equivalent complexity of the world. No matter how hard we try, we can't do that. And even if we did have that, we would still be limited by our senses. We are basically, through our senses, like small pinholes in the cosmos. We are limited by our perspective in time and space. And the variety of our senses is also very narrow and strict and limited, and also in some senses conventional. Probably something that is sweet to us would not be sweet by any measure to an alien from outer space. It is just by convention resulting from our evolutionary heritage that things are like that. And also, I think that Plato, coming from the literary arts, he also knew the importance of people also feeling the material, feeling the writing. There's a large emotional component in good literature. And for sure, there is a lot of emotion as well in his dialogues, his Platonic dialogues featuring Socrates. There is humor. There is humor of different types: ironical humor, slapstick humor. There is grief as well, and the looming notion of mortality. And so these are not just merely technical philosophical texts about ideas that showcase ideas in a dry form without any emotion. Even without having the delivery of trained actors that knew what Plato wanted, we still have some emotional tone in these texts, and so there's a dimension beyond just the mere words. But it could be much greater if we had direct access to Plato and Socrates in an ideal world.
Yeah, so this point that reality is not symbolic and cannot be symbolically represented is something that I might express a little differently. The symbolic systems can represent reality, but imperfectly. And there's a result in cybernetic theory that to symbolically represent a system, the representational system needs at least as much complexity as the system that's being represented. So all of the symbolic systems that we've invented so far and used, as implemented, like physically, not in their potential, because we have symbolic systems that could potentially go off into infinity, but just an actual instantiation, say, on a piece of computer hardware of the symbolic system is a finite system, much, much less complex than the whole of reality, than the whole cosmos. And yeah, Ashby's law of requisite variety is the thing. So the whole cosmos is much more complex than any of our actually implemented symbol systems, and so our symbol systems can't accurately represent the whole cosmos. And there's a quote from I forget who, something to the effect that there's more to reality that can be dreamed of in your philosophy. Forget where that's from, but yeah, I think that's so. This thing about reality not being symbolic and not being able to be represented. I suspect that reality might, in some fundamental sense, be a discrete system, like in the sense of the atomist said, and like there are modern digital physicists that sort of model the whole universe is made up out of discrete things. And so if that's true, then at least in principle, if you had a universe-sized symbolic system, you could represent maybe even larger than the universe-sized symbolic system. You could represent it symbolically with discrete symbols, but we don't have that size. That may be wrong, though. I don't know in the end. But that's yeah. So
yeah, I actually kind of contradict myself here, and you kind of showcased it, because in a previous session when we discussed Zeno's paradoxes, I mentioned that it follows that for Zeno to be wrong and for things to make sense, we need to be in a pixelated universe, and so yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm going to go off in a slightly different direction, but that's me. So some of what they're talking about here is sort of that bi-level sense of truth, where truth has, some truths can be have to be capsulated on multiple levels. It's like trying the word blue. That makes no sense to somebody who doesn't have the sensation of blue. But it's easy to get that person to associate that sensation with the word. And that's part of that whole map territory that I was talking about. And as far as the simplicity, it's sort of like that's what von Neumann was working with back in his von Neumann reproducer with his automata back in the day. And it's the idea that the same set of characters is both the static characters, and then when put into motion, they become something else. And that's essentially the same concept as the DNA. You have the DNA letters, and the one set of DNA encapsulates all of you. But it's starting from that basic one seed, and it's the idea of basically an emergent static seed put into time, producing something complex. Tagging on those.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sorry, go over.
No, just I was saying basically the same thing. That it's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the point about like different levels of truth or different levels of description and sort of different kinds of experiences, I think we'll maybe pick up on it a bit later. But this point about requiring feeling too, I think when we discuss, I forget which one of the was that, probably Theaetetus, when relativism is discussed, I think I'll bring up the point that it's really easy to get into logical difficulties if one doesn't distinguish on a psychological level between preferences and beliefs. So you can ask sort of what makes a belief knowledge, But yeah, if you sort of say it's true for me that a certain temperature is better than another another temperature, you get into weird quagmires. Where if you just say I prefer it cooler rather than warmer, or someone else may have a different preference, and it's not like my preference is wrong and your preference is right. It's just preferences are different kinds of things than beliefs are. So I think that that distinction between preferences and beliefs is really helpful. It helps to clarify people's thinking. And I think to develop a virtue and get the most out of philosophy, it's important to sort of understand that these people are trying to motivate you to have different preferences also. So a lot of what Socrates is doing is trying to persuade young people that growing in knowledge, gaining knowledge, is preferable to gaining in political power or in prestige or in wealth. And so it's preferable for them to spend their time seeking and acquiring knowledge than it is to seeking and acquiring power or wealth. And like if you have this language of preferences that are separate from beliefs, it becomes a little easier to see that's something different that's going on. To knowledge is also, for me at least, makes it very strange for him to say that all virtue boils down to knowledge, because I don't think preferences are a kind of knowledge. I think it's really odd to talk about it that way. And I think people can have, I think a constituent part of virtue is also preferences, and developing virtues sometimes require us to develop our preferences in certain ways. Yeah, I think I've sort of jumped ahead a little bit, but
you're foreshadowing.
For literary effect. I'm just getting impatient.
And I was going to jump even just a hair further ahead, where everything Nerdalliun was saying there had a lot to do with why I'm anxious for Aristotle to come in with the logos and logic to try to straighten Plato out. So tagging on that.
Yeah. One cannot help but notice that when we are dealing with the Platonic dialogues, we cannot but notice, if we really read them attentively, the humor, the literary devices, as we've mentioned, such as allusions, metaphors, using objects as symbols of something else. For instance, many dialogues use the sun as representing the one true good. And things, at least according to some scholars like Michael Segru, whenever we see some of these symbols that are recurrent in the dialogues, we must take notice, because Plato is kind of alluding to something in these symbols or visual metaphors or whatnot. There usually is a surface message with underlying subtext, sometimes even multiple levels of messages in the dialogues. The dialogues also show people, sometimes even Socrates, presenting crappy arguments or bad arguments, or making a point that is flimsy. And if people are reading these and are paying attention, they might even get the impulse to intervene and make an objection. But that is not possible, because this is not an interactive medium. And then as for the themes, there's intellectual rivalry, showcased with the characters portraying the sophists. Some dialogues muse about the nature of what constitutes eroticism and love, and the nature of knowledge, which is usually conflated with virtue. And this might be a problem with the vocabulary from ancient Greek, Attic ancient Greek, and our contemporary languages, because what they might be saying or trying to say is you need to kind of perfect yourself through your lifestyle, and this in a sense makes you more knowledgeable, but it also makes you fitting in a better sense within reality, and in some sense you become more aware of yourself and knowledgeable about how the world works, and what they call virtue emerges from this. And so these things are related. The acquisition of this knowledge, which is not perhaps trivial knowledge like the knowledge of what one ate the day before, but knowledge of how to improve oneself, kind of like the recipe for self-development, self-improvement, and self-knowledge is given in these dialogues. I could not help but notice, which is not different from what one would get from reading the Analects of Confucius or the Dhammapada by the disciples of Buddha, or the poems of Rumi or the meditations of Marcus Aurelius. These writings all bear similarities in which they allude to and many times overlap in the advice they can give to any person reading them regarding recipes for self-improvement, which might be recipes that people carry out without understanding. It's possible. But they might also develop an understanding or a kind of a science of self-improvement. But probably it takes time to develop this understanding. Probably people that start to realize these recipes here given in these dialogues, probably if they start to try to put them into practice, they will kind of be just people carrying out as if recipes without understanding the deeper knowledge or the deeper justifications for the recipes. And well, that is the intro. Before we dive in one dialogue at a time, would you guys like to comment?
I really like the comment about there may be some difficulties originating from limitations in the ancient Greek vocabulary and the Antic dialect of ancient Greek, because that is something that it's a little difficult for non-speakers of Anti-Greek to empathize with, and it's a common feature of philosophy in different languages. The vocabulary one has available does make some thoughts easier to express and other thoughts more difficult to express. And like reading the dialogues, it's difficult to, well, it's easy for me to imagine that there are things that seem like really commonsensical to say even in English, but maybe would have been quite a radical idea to try to even express in Anti-Greek because they didn't have the vocabulary. So I'm not going to go into like a whole rant about this, but one example for me is the distinction between knowledge and understanding. Now, a lot of English speakers won't be able to give a whole doctrine of the difference between understanding and knowledge, but they have an intuitive sense that to understand something deeply is different than just to have knowledge of some facts about it. And in some of the dialogues, it does look like Socrates requires or is seeking understanding and is pointing out like, well, if you don't have understanding, then you don't have knowledge. Whereas in English, it seems kind of obvious that you can have knowledge without understanding. Those are two different things. And it seems to be like one of those things that's conflated, and maybe because the vocabulary don't make clear distinctions between those kinds of things.
It might be sometimes the other way around as well. Sometimes in ancient Greek dialects, there could be some nuances and distinctions between words, like eros and philos, and we just slap on love all the time.
No, exactly. I agree with that one. And Nerdalliun brings up a good point there about the language being the only way that you can express it. And I think we've talked about some of those. The Greeks having more words for things, and he was pointing out how sometimes they have less words. And what you highlighted here is I was very much picking up on and appreciating this time through Plato more, is the idea of Plato the writer. And in a very real sense, he was putting together the sitcoms of his day. And you can see the frustrated playwright there, where he was basically, it starts out with Socrates in the state of quandary. You introduce the characters, they interact, and then Socrates leaves again in a state of quandary. It's sort of like like I said, sitcoms of the day, and it's when you're talking about the themes, it shows me he was trying to hit on the three levels that I keep going back to, which is pathos, logos, ethos, where he's hitting the trying to hit the senses with the erotic, the abstract with the nature of knowledge. And one interesting thing he's doing is it seems like he's trying to introduce the concept of an intellectual rivalry as opposed to sort of the old Homeric, Trojan War, physical slaughtering each other, and sort of like moving the level of combat from the physical realm to the intellectual realm. Going to tag on those observations.
Yeah, Michael Sugru, who was also a source for this material for me, he was also big on that. He comments and emphasizes that Plato wanted to also knock out Homer and Hesiod, not just the sophists, with his writings. He wanted to create a new epic and a new epic hero, where Socrates is superior to both Achilles and Odysseus, and in a better way, a more moralizing way, because he doesn't indulge in violence. That is very obvious. But he is also a humble hero instead of constantly suffering from hubris like these other heroes suffered. So that also struck me as really interesting. But if you guys would like, we can go to the first one, the Euthyphro, the first one that we have here. So
yeah, let's go on with the Plato's Superman of Athens, Socrates.
Yeah. If people know Plato, both Plato and Nietzsche, we kind of get a sense that there are some parallels between both of them. Plato's Socrates and Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which I read really recently. Both are highly syncretic. Both are based on Ionian thought, which is rather interesting. And they go against the institutions. They slaughter with humor, basically, and arguments and whatnot. They are both very highly literary constructions, and only if people kind of read what those guys read, both Plato and Nietzsche, can start to figure out where they're coming from. And even so, we are always limited by our removes from these guys. But I thought the parallels between the two figures of philosophy really interesting. The two literary figures of philosophy, highly literary. Yeah.
I'm just feeling a little amused and distracted by it, so I'm going to mention it. Otherwise, I'm going to stay distracted by it. Like, it's really amazing how far AI art generation has come. Then every now and then they do a hand and fingers like the guy on the right of it.
Yeah. True, but well, if we look at it from far away and we aren't paying attention to the hands, it all seems more or less okay.
It's very good. It's just yeah, that hand is quite disturbing.
Yeah. So basically, the Euthyphro is one of the dialogues that focuses on one of the so-called Platonic virtues. This one is on piety. Socrates confronts the young man called Euthyphro, that gives the title to the dialogue, who was just on his way to charge his father of murdering a slave, and Socrates thinks it's a great time to ask the boy to define piety, which is it has a really kind of artificial setup. I think it's a really big contrast between something really serious and severe that is happening and another serious thing that is kind of related, but let's just take advantage of the situation and inject some really hard philosophy here. One can easily realize how annoyed the young man would be besides being kind of stressed out with the whole entire situation regarding the court case of his father, he's also being kind of berated and approached and then berated intellectually by Socrates. And so Socrates confronts this guy, and he asks really tough questions relating to virtue and the gods or God, which is, do the gods or God dictate morality and goodness, in which case apparently nothing could have been good, or does God want us to do things because they are good? And then Euthyphro famously replies, what is pious is simply that which all the gods love. And then we go into a quandary. Which gods, and what if the gods don't agree with each other? Because, you know, just in the Greek world, there were, according to Hesiod, dozens and dozens of gods and then demigods and whatnot, 400 and something characters in Hesiod's Theogony. And this is only in the Greek world. If you go to the Egypt and Babylon and whatnot, and you start to mix and match and ask what the gods are saying, you will end up with a really very difficult task of figuring out what is good, because there are so many accounts on what these gods say. And so this is the Euthyphro dilemma. Are things really pious because the gods love them, or is it rather the reverse and the gods love things because they are pious? And so, yeah, this is the Euthyphro in a nutshell.
Yeah, it made me think it's a similar quandary that's faced in voting in general, and also in multiple criteria decision making. Like, if all of the voters agree, and all of the in a voting situation, or if we're making it just a decision that has multiple objectives, if all of the objectives are unanimous that one alternative is better than another alternative, it seems fine to say like that alternative is the better one. But then the question is, what if the objectives or what if the voters disagree? How do we determine it then? And that becomes a lot more difficult than to give an unproblematic answer to how to resolve conflicts. And so in this case, it's like the gods are doing voting or something. So if I guess the alternatives would be courses of actions. Like if all the gods agree that one course of action is better than another course of action, then the Euthyphro is saying like, well, then that's the pious thing. And Socrates is asking, but what if they disagree? Which is a really difficult thing to answer. Like, what if they disagree?
Suppose we ask a very difficult moral question to all the best AIs that humanity has produced so far. Would they agree?
If they do agree, then maybe we can call it pious. If they disagree, we don't know what to do.
No, I was going to say this is sort of that whole overall issue with religion, and does man create God? Does God create man? And this is a kind of Plato weighing in using Socrates on that issue, and it's definitely a good one. And that's where again, looking forward to Aristotle with logos and truth. So he kind of cuts through the quagmire. Tagging.
Okay, so let's go to the next one. If you guys just stop me if you don't want me to go.
Actually, just on that last point, I think I forget who, but later an argument was made for a secular morality, and saying that the gods either like something because it's good, and therefore you should do it because it's good, or the gods like things for arbitrary reasons, in which case you shouldn't care about what the gods like and do what's good anyway. So in both cases, what you should do is do the good because it's good, not because the gods tell you so. I think, like, roughly that's the argument. Who's can you guys remember whose argument that is?
This is kind of like a paraphrase of actually the Euthyphro, because Socrates actually asks Euthyphro, do the gods define the things that are good, including actions, or the gods, the things that are good already are ab initio, or from start already good, and the gods just end up liking good things. So what comes before? The gods that then assign goodness to things, or the good things already kind of embedded in the cosmos, and even the gods come after them, and the gods just look and decide to like the good things because they are wise. It's more or less like this. My argument as a person that tries to emphasize humility regarding our knowledge of gods or God, which I kind of fall into, maybe not actually agnostic, but maybe a bit about atheist, because I think that we are at a stage of development as humans in which we probably will never know the underlying and deep truth about the universe in this current state. And so probably we will also never know what is absolutely true about the universe, at least in our current stage of development. And so to cut through this, maybe this is something that Aristotle will argue according to what Gram mentions, but my argument is to try to improve our faculties as best as we can. This is virtue ethics. Always think about the consequences of what you are about to do and weigh in the consequences. This is consequentialist ethics. Try to picture in your mind the absolute perfect being, and try to do as this being that you are picturing in your mind would do. This is divine mandate ethics. And try to figure out how you fit into the world, in a sense. What is your mission in life? What is your raison d'être? What is your duty? And do that. And this is duty ethics. And I think that none of these systems of ethics is necessarily exclusive to one another. I try to embrace them all. And I invite everyone to do as also the same, because we cannot spare any tricks or any solid foundations in regards to morality.
No, I was going to say that, I can approve of all of that one. My sort of take that, again, this is kind of how I was raised with my father, is more of a doing better. It's one of those, I tend to avoid the idea of perfect and like the idea of better, where it's like, I know I can try to be better me today than I was yesterday, and tomorrow I can try to be even better than today. And setting my standard of metric versus myself and how I can improve. And the other thing that I factor in there is basically a harm-based metric. Try to do as little harm as possible to other people, and try to help as much as I can. And that's sort of my wrinkle on your extra wrinkles on what you were saying, tagging on that.
Nerdalliun, any comments before we go to the Charmides?
I think we can carry on with the comedies. I'm trying to look up. I could swear there's a quote that I'm misremembering.
Okay.
But I got a bunch of stuff about the Euthyphro dilemma. So
yeah. It's almost like we are looking at the Euthyphro, so it's like one of the fingers of a hand, and then piety, and then we're looking at courage, maybe the big finger, the tallest finger, and then we will look into each of these fingers. So Charmides is a dialogue about temperance, the virtue of temperance. So one of these virtues that probably is attached to an underlying important and essential truth that probably is ineffable or unfathomable. But nevertheless, Socrates tries to talk about temperance with a young boy, a young man in this dialogue, who is called Charmides. I even was left wondering if the word charm might be traceable back to the name of this young man. The etymology only goes back to medieval France with the word charme, which supposedly means incantation, magic charm. But I still suspect that there might be some etymological history here with the word charm and Charmides. So who knows? There's also this pattern of so many words coming from ancient Greek. Also, in this dialogue, so the dialogue starts as an inquiry on ethics. The virtue ethics focused on temperance. It then, surprisingly or not, just like the Euthyphro, pivots to dealing with the epistemology. How can we know what we know? And this happens as a pattern in many dialogues, starting with a particular virtue. In this dialogue, the setup is Socrates has just arrived back in Athens after years of service in the army and a recent escape from a brutal battle, maybe the Battle of Delian. He heads for a palestra to find his old friends who ask him about the battle. He just shifts the conversation to his two favorite subjects, which are about the state of philosophy in Athens and whether there are any particularly wise or beautiful youths there at the moment. And so they reply, this young man, Charmides, is heading here. And Socrates asks him, Charmides, do you have the virtue of temperance? And Charmides replies, it would be boastful to say yes, but I would bring shame on myself if I said no. And so he neither replies yes or no, but kind of shows that he has a potential in his intellect. And so this guy, Charmides, he won't be a pupil of Socrates. He will be captivated by Critias, which is an Athenian tyrant. Charmides even goes so far as to suggest that temperance is doing one's business, or basically doing one's duty, kind of alluding to maybe duty ethics. And so maybe in part it's doing one's duty, but that doesn't tell the whole story. And then Critias also weighs in and says that temperance is doing what one should, which is Charmides' master, and it's related to self-knowledge. And then he leaps to temperance is self-knowledge, and then temperance is self-knowledge is knowledge of knowledge. And so he's clearly lost. He's just trying to employ words and throw words at Socrates. And of course, the dialogue ends in a stalemate. And that's my take on the Charmides.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things in the Charmides about knowledge in general. I actually think in like several of the dialogues we're going to be talking about today, knowledge is a big thing, and Peterson draws our attention that often either discussions begin with a talk about some kind of virtue and end up in a conversation about knowledge, or start with a conversation about knowledge and end up at virtue, and sort of illustrating, at least in Plato's mind, that the Socratic doctrine that virtue and knowledge are like basically identical, not even just closely related things. So yeah, I don't make any notes about this specific dialogue. There were a couple of things that stood out to me. I think this is a dialogue. I may be a bit confused about which dialogue it came in, but there was some claims about to know something you get for free that you also know that you know, and if you don't know that you know, then maybe you don't know. I think they used the example of 2 + 2 = 4. If you know that 2 + 2 = 4, you also know that you know 2 + 2 = 4. If you don't know that you know 2 + 2 = 4, then maybe you don't know that to plus 2 equals 4. And yeah, so that kind of discussion made me think. I'm not so sure I would place on as a requirement for knowledge a conscious awareness of it. So I think back then they also didn't have concepts for non-conscious or unconscious or subconscious knowledge versus conscious knowledge, and so that I think also sort of muddles the dialogue a little bit. And yeah, so I think the points could have been stated a bit more clearly if they could distinguish between unconscious and conscious knowledge, which they probably couldn't in their vocabulary. But also, philosophy has to start somewhere, so it's like similar to the Ionians, where there's a bunch of their science that has been superseded, but they kind of started a conversation down a certain line, without which maybe we wouldn't have gotten to our, well, we probably wouldn't have gotten to, well, maybe we would have gotten to the same science we have these days, but in a different way, taken a different route, and maybe some of the things we know today we wouldn't have known, and some other things we don't know yet we would have known. But so it's part of the historic track record to get there. But yeah, so that's the only thing I can think of to comment about the dialogue right now.
Yeah, what jumps out here is Socrates was basically asking Charmides a do you still beat your wife question when he was asking about do you have temperance? And this kind of presages that whole Epimenides paradox coming up. And what I see that Plato's wrestling with is the idea of truth on the ethos level, which is that duty bound, that you're doing what the society expects of you, versus Socrates is pointing more towards a logos or even pathos sort of level, where again it's the multi-level truth, and that's seems to be he's wrestling with the idea of ethos truth trumping all, again presaging Aristotle, trying to bring it all into a system. Hagen.
Yeah, maybe this system of multi-level knowledge alludes to the more contemporary concept of conscious and unconscious knowledge. So when people kind of have muscle memory to do things excellently, they might not be even able to describe it, like dancers or whatnot. They might rather just do the choreography instead of explaining it, because it's in a different language altogether. While people can easily say basic truths that almost everyone learned in basic arithmetic or whatnot, and we might spend our days not going consciously to 1 + 1 = 2, but as soon as it is recalled, we go into the recesses of our memory, and it is easily findable, and becomes conscious really quickly. And so we might have a bunch of competencies and pieces of knowledge in our memory that we are not bringing right now to the forefront of our consciousness, much less to our conversation, but they are there nonetheless. And memories, I think, are kind of like strings with beads, and they have many connections in between the beads, not just linear connections, and we need to kind of tug at a part of the memory, like, oh, you mean that sum that equals 2, and then 1 + 1 also comes along. So I think there is a network or a compounding nature regarding knowledge, and I kind of felt it with the delving into ancient philosophy since less than 2 years ago. I was before naive to ancient philosophy mostly, and then I started gaining knowledge of Greco-Roman, and I started figuring out that when I study guys from Socrates' time, I kind of get some notions on Homer as a bonus. And then when I read Homer, Homer gives me further context that enhances things from Socrates' era. And so, yeah, definitely, if we keep on acquiring knowledge on a field, we will see that the effects add up non-linearly, or rather the benefits add up non-linearly, which kind of hints at the fact that knowledge has a synergistic self-reinforcing or maybe even emergent properties.
Yeah, so just a very easy example to get a practical demonstration that people can have knowledge that they're not conscious of is you could give people a list of 1,000 random words and just display them on a computer screen one word at a time and ask them to pay attention to that list of words. Then once you're done with the list of words for any amount of time, just let it rest and ask them to reproduce as many words as they can from that list. And they'll be able to reproduce however many number of words correctly, and they'll probably produce some words that weren't on the list. But so you could say they know that so trying their best, they get 50 words, and they know those 50 words were on the list. But then you ask the question differently, and you present them with a list of 2,000 words, one by one, and you ask them, was this word on the first list you saw or no? And they'll get that question right much better than chance, remembering whether the word they're seeing now had been on the first list that they've seen. So they get many more than, say, 50 words right. And in some sense, they still knew whether the words you showed them, like, it was this word on the list or was it not. If you asked them, was dog on the list, was table on the list, was, they could correctly answer yes or no. But if you ask them list all the words that you can remember that were on the list, they won't be able to remember nearly as many as they knew were on the list. So that's like just a very simple example of how knowledge can be like below the level of conscious awareness, access to the knowledge. It's there, they know it, but they can't access it necessarily. And that would, I think, even just stating that in Attic Greek, like talking about that experiment, probably would have been a little tricky to do in Attic Greek.
No, I was going to say that's an interesting one. What pops into my mind that experiment might be showing is that person has a memory of an association with that word, even if they don't remember the word specifically. You know, in their conscious sort of thing. They have the association, and the only way that gets triggered is if they see that word again. It's sort of like a trigger memory. Tagging on that.
Yeah. And due to these properties that you just described, Nerdalliun, there are people that use tricks to remember things more effectively. Kind of like association of images with the words. Like if the word is dog, they picture a dog very vividly, and thus it reinforces the memorization. Or when you are meeting a new person, a trick to memorize their name, which so many people are left kind of forgetting the first 2 or 3 seconds, is to use their name abundantly in the first few minutes while you're talking to them. Kind of you make a point consciously to yourself to do that, to use their name, and it will tend to stick more. When we kind of use or employ knowledge or skills, it obviously reinforces those. It probably creates what is correlated with reinforcement of neural connections, thus making the recall much more rapid or effective, and with less loss of the information that has been memorized. And with this, if you guys want, if you guys are okay, we can go to the Euthydemus, one of the more satirical and maybe nastiest dialogues, because in this dialogue, Socrates engages with two young fellows, young blokes, who are called Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus. And these guys were, before, in their previous career, they were working as martial art trainers. They even trained people to use armors and weapons and whatnot. And they probably figured out and that there's much more money to make in sophistry. And so these guys changed really drastically from a very physically intense, maybe involving some strategy. So to give credit to the military career, it also has by necessity intellectual development and merit. But these guys went 180 and went to full-blown sophistry and rhetoric. There's even the employment of the word heuristic sophistry, which is the act of engaging in showy logical disputation. And so basically what either Segru or Adamson, I'm not sure at this point, they even describe them as sophistic fireworks. And so Socrates faces this pair of paradox mongers who became specialists thus in verbal violence instead of physical violence. They boast that they can teach wisdom and virtue, but in reality they just bamboozle people with their bewildering wordplay and arguments. An example question that was posed in this dialogue is it the ignorant or the wise who learns? And then a person would reply, a poor naive person to these guys would reply, it's obviously the ignorant, because the ignorant needs to learn. But then they would reply, well, the ignorant has no ability to learn. And then the other person just goes and reluctantly says, okay, it's the wise person that learns. And then they will say, but the wise person has learned all there is to learn, so he doesn't need to learn. And also they would say, well, you have a dog and your dog had puppies, so that dog is a father and that dog is yours. So if that dog is yours and it's a father, it's your father. Also, it's worthwhile to give a little bit of context with this dialogue. The dramatic action happened on the day before, when Socrates met the two brothers, Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus, at the Lyceum, and it's being retold by Socrates to Crito, who was at the site, but he couldn't listen and couldn't understand the conversation due to the noisy crowd. So it's kind of alludes to the fact that conversation breaks down when people make a lot of noise and nullify the signal. So Crito asks, who was he, Socrates, with whom you were talking yesterday in the Lyceum? And Socrates answers, I was conversing not only with Euthydemus, but with his brother Dionysiodorus. And so, according to Segru, Euthydemus was considered the half-wit in this pair of brothers, and the Dionysiodorus was the nitwit in this pair of brothers. So they are not equally witless. There's some nuance here, and so this dialogue even ends up yielding one of Socrates' positions, which is a rare thing to see. So Socrates argues that things that seem good are only good if used with knowledge, example, money or health. And that's pretty much what I had of notes on this dialogue. And go ahead, guys.
Yeah, so this one is one I made a note of, because I think this one kind of illustrates why it would be easy for someone like Aristophanes to equate Socrates with the other sophists. So we have in this dialogue a contrast with sort of, I think what in Plato's mind was the worst abuses of like a bad kind of sophistry, versus what he saw as a noble kind of sophistry in Socrates, his hero that's supposed to triumph Homer or whatever. And so like if this very stark contrast against the supposedly noble philosopher versus the ignoble sophists, at least in the way that Peterson states Socrates' position. Socrates' argument isn't all that much better than these two guys. These two guys make really stupid arguments, and Socrates' arguments are smarter for sure, but not that much smarter. They consist of like 1 and 2 extra steps in the argument, so they're a little bit more nuanced. But they're mistaken, and they're fallacious arguments all the same. And I think the thing that's being illustrated in this dialogue is not so much the method of argumentation that's so much different. That like both these two brothers and Socrates often engage in a sort of fallacious rhetoric rather than a strict logic. But Socrates is genuinely trying to persuade people to live more virtuous lives, and he's trying to lead them to have a thirst for knowledge in general, which he thinks is all there is to virtuous life, mistakenly. But yeah, that's quite different from guys who are just trying to make a buck and trying to be impressive and trying to bamboozle people. And so, like that intentionality or that intention behind the actions, I think, is a bigger distinction between these two brothers and Socrates. With the example of like the arguments, like Socrates' arguments aren't that much better, honestly, than these two guys.
I would kind of explain that away by Socrates being kind of aware of their level, and Socrates kind of descending down to their level as a great communicator. But this is just an aside. Go ahead, Gram.
I was going to say, this is an example of Plato letting his writers shine through, where this is, I see these guys as, they stopped doing the military stuff and became grifters, intellectual grifters, and kind of an original old comedy team, sort of Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, like they're doing a good cop, bad cop, and there's no, there's no way they can lose. They become a buzzsaw where they just, sophistry, where one takes one position, one takes the opposite, and regardless of what position you take, you're arguing with one of the two. And it's just, I just love the way Plato just plays that here. Tagging.
Yeah. So should we move to the next one? The next one is a big one.
Yeah.
So the Gorgias. This one is literally the face-off between Socrates and Gorgias with a host of his other sophists. So the big boss sophist and the smaller sophists. It's almost like the situations in video games when you have the smaller bosses and the bigger boss. And well, this is how it comes out to me with my video game minded culture. And of course, we by having studied prominent sophists like Gorgias, of course, this is the character Gorgias that Plato is writing in here. So probably a caricature of the real historical figure Gorgias, but nonetheless, it produces a really vivid and interesting dialogue. So literally, Socrates trades verbal blows with Gorgias and his two students, Polus and Callicles. The setup of this dialogue is Socrates and his friend Chaerephon, which, mind you, is the same guy who goes to the Oracle of Delphi to get the information that Socrates is the wisest, the pithy saying. And so he discusses Gorgias' status as an eminent rhetorician. Socrates desires to question Gorgias about the scope and nature of rhetoric. So the two head towards the home of Callicles, where the great sophists can be found. And mind you, Callicles is one of the Athenian elite, and he kind of stands in for an irredeemable hedonist that is beyond Socrates' abilities to call to reason. So despite the name of the dialogue, the name is kind of like a ruse or a ploy to hide the true black diamond of this dialogue, which is actually Callicles. Callicles accuses Socrates of exploiting feelings of shame of both Gorgias and Polus. and Callicles comes out here as a more extreme version of what we can see in Thrasymachus' character in the book 1 of the Republic. He claims justice is bad and injustice is good, and the former is merely the set of conventional rules that society uses to keep the strongest in line. So clearly he is an absolutist in the doctrine of might makes right. But at the same time, Callicles is so intemperate and shares so little common ground with Socrates that he goes into a tantrum. And mid-dialogue, he refuses to answer any more questions by Socrates. This is actually a pattern that is found in several dialogues, where one of the interlocutors of Socrates is so well shown that he cannot engage in dialectic, and neither dialectic neither rhetoric. He is no match to the character Socrates, that he just refuses to talk anymore. But the main figure here is the main sophist is Gorgias, so one of the great teachers of ancient Greece. The same guy who we said wrote the encomium on Helen and on not being. All people educated by him, according to Plato, become uneducable and stupid. Their thinking has become deformed. This is according to Michael Segru. He teaches darkness, ignorance, the anti-Delphic lack of self-knowledge. Gorgias also describes rhetoric as the art of persuading in the absence of knowledge. And he is ultimately shamed by Socrates into claiming he could teach his students virtue. Basically, he enters this trap, and Socrates quickly shows that he cannot teach virtue. And according to Michael Segru, the Callicles figure is an image of the Athenian politician with a corrupt eros for the demos. He has a corrupt love or desire for the people, not because he likes the people as an end, but rather they are a means by which he can increase his own power. So no one ever saw anyone like this in contemporary days, right? So this is my account of the Gorgias.
Yeah, I want to share like a humorous thing. There's a comedian called Dylan Moran, I think Dylan Moran, yeah. And there's a skit he does about children, how sense of purpose they have and determination that a lot of adults kind of just drag through life and listless and not motivated to do things. That contrasts a lot with children. Like they're up and about and they're walking with a purpose. And you ask this question like, where are you going? What are you up to? And the kid just like full confidence. I'm going to put this harmonica inside of the toilet. And you ask him, why the hell do you do that? And the kid just says, enough questions. And he carries on and he goes and does this. So that little childish attitude, enough questions, done with this.
Or like Arnold Schwarzenegger's Conan, enough talk. And just starts slaughtering.
So Caligula makes you think of that.
Yeah.
Refuse to answer more questions. Actually, Peter Amson sort of explicitly states this is one of the places where we have surviving evidence of Gorgias' writing himself. And he himself was very careful to claim that he doesn't teach virtue and he doesn't know how to teach virtue. He teaches rhetoric, it's a different kind of thing. Whereas Plato puts in his mouth the words that he does teach virtue, and then he uses that position to humiliate him. So it's probably one of the earliest like red-handed examples of a straw man argument used to shame someone in public.
Definitely, I was gonna pick up on Rogerio's. This is sort of Plato's boss fight in the episode, and that whole refusing to answer, that's very much reflected in today's cancel culture, where if I don't like what you're saying, you're canceled. And this again, it's I pull my pathos, logos, ethos distinctions because that's how the ancients taught rhetoric later on. After Aristotle parsed everything out, that's where they did it. And back here is before Aristotle, so everything was all in one giant group, which is why, you're having such a problem at this point. Is sort of what I'm seeing. So tagging on those.
Also, I left out there are 3 Socratic positions that I identified in this dialogue, which is, it is better to suffer wrongdoing than to do wrong oneself. Virtue is knowing how to get what is really good, so it leads us to what is most beneficial. And then moral virtue is centrally important to happiness. And so these are themes that are extremely prevalent in the Cynics and the Stoics later on. It's also worthwhile to mention a nice visual metaphor that I think provides food for thought when Socrates is debating with Callicles. Socrates metaphorizes or creates a visual that the soul is like a vessel. And for an intemperate individual like Callicles, it's a larger vessel with holes in it, and happiness is kind of like the fluid that we need to fill in, so that a person can be content and satisfied. And since he has many holes in it, which represent his desires, his passions, his vices, especially, he constantly needs money. He needs money. He needs wealth. He needs power, and he's basically called on to satisfy this imperfect vessel. He instrumentalizes the demos of Athens to get what he wants, to keep his vessel full despite the holes. And while Socrates says that a temperate person, a person with more self-control like him, and considering his supposed lifestyle, he might have a point in this. He claimed he needed little to be content and to be happy, and had no strings attached to other people, and so he didn't have any temptation at all to instrumentalize others. He even treated others mostly as an ends and not a means, in contrast to Callicles. And so I think this point is also really important to bring up.
Yeah, there's only slightly more detail, and maybe I should have just remembered the detail. But the argument that the argument in favor of the position that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice was one of the examples where that argument isn't very complicated, and it seems highly problematic. Like, it doesn't strike me as an airtight logical argument at all, although it's persuasive in the manner of sophistical arguments. There was something else I wanted to say about Gorgias. So the 3 positions that Socrates defends here is, it's better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice. Happiness is dependent on virtue, and there's one about knowing.
Virtue is knowing how to get what is really good, so it leads us to what is most beneficial.
Yeah, so I think I've spoken quite a bit about the knowledge of good and virtue, and those being, in my mind, not identical things, although they're related things. But I wanted to make a point about happiness and virtue. But the Greeks had a word that's quite difficult to translate into English for happiness, which is eudaimonia, which is something like, we don't really have a noun for it, but you can invent a kind of phrase for it, which would be something like good-spirited, or like good, well-souled, or like wholesome-souled.
Or good-natured, or successful in a really broad sense.
Yeah, so
another one might be in good spirits is one that I've heard as well, in good spirits. So,
but it's important to characterize eudaimonia as a state that can be long-lived. It's different to
just a good mood that we use good spirits for.
Yeah, it's different. Happiness cannot do it justice, the word happiness, because happiness comes and goes, because it's mostly in our contemporary conception. Happiness is dependent on external stuff, or rather, it's emphatically dependent on external stuff. While eudaimonia, arguably, even according to the cynics who go more hardcore on this, they say that being virtuous is all there is to both virtue and eudaimonia. You just need to keep your soul clean, do always what is best, what is good, and you will have a perpetual sense of a state of eudaimonia.
Yeah. So maybe if you didn't want to invent something, just use something that's used in modern academic circles. I think probably the closest would be psychological well-being, as a kind of holistic psychological well-being that goes beyond just a good mood in the moment, but like well-constituted mind, well-constituted emotions, well-regulated emotions, sort of bunch of skills and knowledge and good relations with people, and the ability to navigate the world and oneself and compose oneself in wholesome, healthy ways.
I'm also going to foreshadow again a little bit, since I mentioned the Stoics and the Cynics. Also, the Epicurus would really go emphatically and distinguish quite with a lot of work between the sense pleasures that can be vicious and can ruin one's health and one's economies, to mental pleasure or mental satisfaction. And so maybe it's equivalent to what you are alluding to, Nerdalliun. Anything, Graham?
I got nothing to add to that. I agree with good discussion.
I got one more thing about the gorgeous dialogue in talking to, is it Callicles? Am I saying Callicles? Is that the name?
Yeah, Callicles is the worst guy, the worst character, bad guy.
Yeah, it's like Nietzsche on steroids. His response to him, in response to him, Socrates also makes the claim about sort of freedom and power, where he sort of talks about how tyrants who have a lot of social power and indulge in their senses are in a way a slave to their passions and a slave to their desires, and chasing one desire after the other is a life of a man that's more in servitude than the life of a man who has his desires completely composed and under control and lives a very moderate, very modest and frugal and temperate, some might say ascetic kind of life. And I think there's an important insight there, and it's an insight I've most recently heard by some Buddhist teachers. There's like sort of the freedom to get what you want, and the freedom from what you want. So there's a different kind of freedom where you can free yourself from your desires, that you're no longer bound by them, which is a kind of freedom. But yeah, so I thought that's a really interesting point by Socrates, this notion that holding the reins of one's own desires is a higher kind of power than tyrants have. I'm not so convinced that those are mutually exclusive, though, and I don't know if it's just the way Peterson presented it, or if Socrates kind of presents them as two different kinds of life, where the life of, like, the social power of a tyrant necessarily goes along with the inability to control their passions, and the ability to control their passions necessarily leads to a ascetic life that's outside of the political sphere. I think you can have those two things together. You can have a bunch of social power and a bunch of self-control, and even if you do have a bunch of self-control, you may still decide to indulge in stuff. I don't think Socrates would disagree with that, because Peterson, I think, discussed with Wolff on Socrates how Socrates did actually indulge in quite a bit of pleasures, but in a more detached way. So yeah, so
kind of like drinking in the symposium, and then the next day he wasn't thinking of drinking anymore. He was just happy that the thing happened, and that's very different from a guy like Alcibiades wanting to chase the next young beautiful person to put in his bed after he's fed up with the previous one. Or like Caligula, who who did indulge in everything conceivable, ruining his empire and himself in the process, or Nero. And so, yeah, Adamson also talked about these fellows that ended up being the closest person to their lifestyle, and so one of the persons that would end up getting violently killed by their lifestyle. Either they would get killed by a human's hand, or ruin their health and eventually die from cirrhosis or an STD or obesity or a heart attack or something like that. And so there was even an emperor who died just because he got so angry. He burst a blood vessel and died. And so this kind of lack of self-control can get people in the most sometimes predictable ways, but sometimes unpredictable. But in the end, it makes sense. It's all mechanistic. But generally, I would prefer my leaders with huge doses of temperance instead of guys that, like, we had a mayor here who every lunch day or every day after lunch he was drunk, and no one could have any productive meetings with him in the afternoon. Fortunately, democracy worked and we voted him out. But that's a digression. But it's a valid example for this. If we can choose between temperate and intemperate leaders, there's a gradient. There's not just the extremes of ascetics and unrecoverable hedonists. There's people mostly find themselves in between these extremes. But having to choose these extremes, I would tend to choose people that have better self-control, because leadership provides many contexts of challenges to that self-control. I would argue even that self-control is even more important to leaders than to people that wield more power than people who wield less power.
No, definitely agree there. You don't want your lead to give the leaders power to help the people and then just have them use it to help themselves. That's a bad idea. And the one I was going to add with the idea of suffering injustice rather than also performing injustice, I think is Socrates' idea of trying to minimize the amount of injustice in the world, and sort of phrasing it, two wrongs don't make a right sort of concept. Tagging.
Yeah, he seems like an intellectual descendant, not only of the Ionians and Pythagoras and whatnot, and Parmenides and Anaxagoras that we mentioned, but also of that guy who in the Mytilenean debate argued for not slaughtering the people of the island of Lesbos. His name escapes me, but I think he is a worthy hero of the people.
Definitely.
should we do the Meno?
Let's do the Meno. So, Meno. Socrates demonstrates the Socratic method in action and argues for the theory of recollection. And so, in this dialogue, we can witness something really remarkable, which is a series of questions without any sharing of knowledge, no expository method at hand, with a person, a slave child who was completely naive to geometry, only knew Greek. And Socrates showed to this child how to reach a triangle that was double the area of a previous triangle, and only, as I've mentioned, only using questions in succession, hence the Socratic method of teaching. It's also worthwhile to mention that this dialogue also has some foreshadowing. One of the characters that appears here, similarly to Callicles in the Gorgias, is a guy that stands for the Athenian elite. He's called Anytus, and who enters toward the end of the dialogue. Stands in for the somber and considered values of the Athenian political elite, and as an Athenian conservative, despite the sophists generally, a bit like Aristophanes' kind of conservatism, but without the humor. He even threatens Socrates, says that due to the investigation of virtue Socrates was doing, so he threatens him, and he will be one of the three accusers of Socrates, along with Miletus and Lycon. Also, this one of the main interlocutors of Socrates in this dialogue is the namesake of the dialogue, Mino, who is a student of Gorgias. You probably have heard of Gorgias by now. Readily admits to being an enthusiastic follower of the sophist. Mino also serves as a kind of a sophist foil for Socrates' logical points. So even though none of these big sophists are present, Mino serves as a stand-in. He's also a naive believer in the kind of pompous, elaborately rhetorical but largely vacuous sophist methods of philosophy. And in this dialogue, we have Mino's paradox, which is either you know something or you don't. If you know it, you don't need to inquire into it since you already know it. If you don't know it, then you do need to inquire about it. But how can you? After all, you don't know what it is. So how will you go about searching for it? And how will you recognize it if you do come across it? This almost seems like the perfect problem to pose successively to human culture until the scientific method appears. Then there's a visual metaphor about true beliefs that are like magical statues that, if not fastened down to the ground, will run away. And I kind of interpret this as, if you engage in telling to the next generation what is correct, they might get the gist of it and then actually do what is correct. But then when it comes to teaching the next generation, since they only know the recipe and they don't have the understanding underlining the recipe, they are at a greater risk of losing bits and parts that are crucial for the recipe. And they might even hand down to the next generation something that has become distorted, corrupted, or even incomplete. And so this is the Mino, and according to my notes.
Yeah. There's a story in the history of computation that is a very quick story. I think it's Charles Babbage was designing computing machines that do arithmetic automatically, some of the early ones. I think they were mechanical machines, not electronic machines. But upon sort of marketing and displaying the machine in fairs, he got some feedback from some public members. And one of the questions he got was, supposing I accidentally input the incorrect numbers for an addition, will the machine still be able to give me the correct answer? And Babbage's response was just, I can't even begin to imagine the confusion of ideas that would lead a person to ask such a question. just stumped. There's something wrong about this person's understanding of how the world works, and I don't even know where to begin to fix it. And I feel a little bit similar about Socrates' theory of recollection as how learning happens. It seems very obviously very wrong, but I don't even know what sort of misconception makes it look even plausible to him to argue this is how learning works. Yeah, it's just doesn't. I don't understand how
You want to pick up the torch, Graham?
Yeah, sort of a that does not compute. No, I see where he's trying to trying to reach for, but again, I'm with Nerdalliun. It just doesn't quite work. It's more or less it's like he's trying to display it as a static thing, where learning is more of an active process, and he doesn't have the process aspect of it really even remotely touched with in this, as far as I can tell. Tagging on that.
I could try attempting to be the devil's advocate or the opposition here, and kind of try to defend Plato's Socrates here, in the sense that if you try to teach another animal that has sense of hearing, you can argue that he heard what you taught, but he did not recollect anything because he had nothing to recollect. And so this is kind of like my attempt at explaining why they might have thought this way. Human beings are kind of in potential ready for learning, while other beings are not in such a fashion. There's also this concept that human brains are really complex objects, the most complex objects identified so far by human beings. And in potential, they can do many things. Brains can incorporate many competences, many different competences, even after the early years in life, where people claim that most learning occurs. The brain continues learning so far as it is exposed to new patterns, and the external patterns kind of make the brain identify pre-existing internal patterns in the kind of neural matrix that already is there, and the brain just forms connections in the pre-existing neural matrix, or new neurons are produced entirely to fit different patterns, different neural circuits that are needed. And so, yeah, I could try to sort of explain that there is some merit, even though I can understand that learning needs to be something that is acquired, in a sense, because people go to school, they don't know how to learn to read, rather, and then after looking at letters enough times, they start to put letters together to say the corresponding sounds and say words and whatnot, and then eventually they learn how to read. But besides Socrates, Noam Chomsky is also a defender of this idea of a priori learning is already present. It's kind of like there is a state of pre-learning existing before learning, in which the structures of the human brain are already fit to learn language and whatnot. And it's not entirely out of proportion, because humanity has been traditionally, for many millennia before civilization, proficient in tracking. And we see this today in the people of the Kalahari Desert, who are so good at tracking that they look at tracks, and they kind of interpret the tracks as symbols, meaning that animal that made this track was limping. He was this years old. He also traveled through here at certain time of the day, because the animals like to go through the shade, and maybe there was a shade there. And he had some such and such animals with him, and a predator behind him and whatnot. And so people can interpret patterns from reality, since human beings are human beings. And so maybe all this evolutionary heritage of interpreting signs or rather features of the real world and associating them with other things that are detached from these initial things, with a time lag, with a difference in time or a difference in space, or both, as in the example of the trackers. This might have made kind of a pre-learning or a pre-built structure in the human brain that predisposes the human brain to be symbolically able.
Yeah, all right. So there's a bunch in there. I think Peter Adamson sort of addresses the comparison of Socrates' position with more modern positions of innate knowledge, like Noam Chomsky proposes, and sort of points out that elsewhere this theory is really used to argue for the immortality of the soul, and so it's really like it's a position where we have immortal souls that existed before we were born, and they've always existed, and in that eternity of existence, they have learned everything there is to learn. So when we're born, we don't really learn; we just recollect things we already knew, and that's how it's possible for us to acquire knowledge. And it's in response to a sophistical logical paradox for it being impossible to learn. And that sophistical paradox is very similar to other paradoxes we've seen by Zeno and by Parmenides. And there's some linguistic assumptions built in and some exploitation of vague language to even present the paradox. And the paradox goes away if one used more terms and distinguish between different things. So careful not to equivocate, and if one understood a bit more about how minds work, how brains work, some knowledge of psychological findings would have been very helpful for Socrates not to get into this kind of state where it seemed a puzzle how someone who doesn't have knowledge can possibly acquire knowledge, because that seems to logically require something that's impossible. And like a strategy that these Greeks seemed not to take very seriously, as they could observe just reality around them, notice people do seem to acquire knowledge, and use that as a clue that maybe their logic went wrong somewhere if they're concluding it's impossible. But often they reach into metaphysical solutions to these logical paradoxes. And I think this is one of those cases where this is logical paradox, and we'll solve it by inventing a metaphysical solution that we have no evidence for, no way to test, and that doesn't really help us do anything practical. So if you have this theory of recollection, you can't really predict anything. You can predict. So if this is your theory of learning, it's not going to help you become a better teacher. It's not going to help you predict student performance. It's a worthless theory. Like really, it's like scientifically has no merit to it.
But the Socratic method?
It doesn't really, like the theory of recollection doesn't suggest the Socratic method as a method of teaching. If it doesn't follow from the theory of recollection that the Socratic method is a good way to teach. So those two things are independent. The example is a good example of using the Socratic method to teach, especially in mathematics. I could use it in different domains as well. Socrates mostly uses it to try to motivate humility and the seek for knowledge rather than to teach anything, which is a completely different application than this one. So this is a nice contrast to his usual application.
Maybe the theory of recollection is like a fancy myth that makes people kind of get a sense of awe at their potential, at their abilities, which in my adaptation to the real world would be to try to communicate a sense of awe at the potential of an individual by virtue of their physiological characteristics, namely the human brain. The brain, when it arises, even before birth, when it develops in all its complexity and potential, although it's not as complex as the universe, as we've mentioned before, it is extremely complex. It has a lot of that Ashby's sweet requisite variety to be able to do a lot of fancy and sophisticated stuff.
No, I agree. I was going to say on the theory of recollection, one of the aspects that, again, the scientific critique of it about it not being applicable or testable or anything like that is, well, it feels good. And that's kind of useful when you're dealing with rhetoric. That's an appeal to pathos. And I think some of what they're dealing with is like the difference between RAM and ROM. And it's like our instinctive knowledge base and capacity to learn, and our instinctive base is basically the RAM. It's hardwired into us. And part of that RAM allows the writing of the ROM so that we can learn. And I've always found that sort of analogy kind of useful in this situation. Tagging on those.
Can't argue against that. Any other words?
I'm in a state of aporia. I refuse to answer any more questions.
Yeah. Well, to call a really important point, the state of aporia is very important for philosophical pursuits, because being confronted with our limitations or where our knowledge ends, the frontier of our knowledge, is one of the essential things of an intellectual pursuit. And so even though many people might interpret the state of aporia at the end of many of these dialogues as a letdown, kind of like, oh man, at least they could have given me the nice, neat answer at the end. They don't. And even this supposedly wise character called Socrates doesn't get any closer to the truth, but he gets closer to an internal truth, which is he confronts his own ignorance more closely. He learns a bit more about his ignorance, and if things went well with the other characters as well. And so I think this is also really it has a lot of value to in terms of self-knowledge, to get a bit more knowledgeable about our limitations, our ignorance, so that we may learn.
So just the Meno is one of the middle dialogues, right?
I can check that really quick. Yeah.
The middle dialogues. Because in the earlier dialogues, it would have been uncharacteristic for Socrates to sort of share a theory of anything. Because,
yeah. Maybe Plato was already influenced by Vedic wisdom from several removes through Pythagoras already in this one, because of course he alludes to this thing that he's full of wisdom that exists before us and that we kind of draw from, and it already alludes to the immortality of the soul. And so it might be due to these influences.
so that would have been after his travels, after Plato's worldly travels.
Yeah, these 20 years. Yeah.
Traveled the world, presumably had lots of conversations with people because he was a fan of dialogues.
Yeah.
And maybe exposed to some ideas, and this was one of the ideas that to him looked attractive, and he used Socrates as a mouthpiece to put forth the idea to the Greeks.
Yeah, he might have thought, since I'm already so competent in and expert in writing Socrates as a character, why not keep on going? Maybe it's kind of like these guys that are at least they think that they are completely honest people, and then end up stealing hotel towels just because they can. And maybe Plato found himself in a similar situation. He started by writing Socrates to kind of clear Socrates' image as his master that he loved so much. And then, well, since I've already written a bunch of these, and I've already put words in his mouth that he never said, since I've already committed all this kind of false portrayal, why not go one step further and just put the pedal to the metal? And also the other dialogue that also advocates much more clearly and much more emphatically for the immortality of the soul. The Phaedo is also one of the middle dialogues. Yeah, and the other one, the last one that we will mention today.
I was going to say, what you're talking about is that writer in Plato. And as I was picking up, this is where I see he's doing it in an episodic manner, sort of sitcom-like, where next dialogue with Socrates, we continue along this path. And once he had already set up that pattern, it was just, he already knew how to write like that, and people were responding to it just too easy, just to keep that ball rolling. Tagging.
Yeah. Maybe even took advantage of getting new ideas to make things interesting. Who knows? So, and the other one is the Theaetetus. So Socrates contemplates truth. So not stopping in a station before and then going to knowledge or truth. Truth in the context of looming mortality with a bedridden youth about to die of a lethal infection from a battle. So a question posed here is, how does knowledge relate to true beliefs? Socrates examines the nature of knowledge with an interlocutor of excellence for variety here, which is Theaetetus, who is an apprentice of a mathematician called Theodorus. So this is a kind of a sad or a melancholic dialogue, because there is the implication or human mortality is very present here. Socrates, after all, is also with his days accounted for. He mentions at the end of the dialogue that he is going to face charges that are all these Athenian elites that we were mentioning before, becoming very distressed and frustrated and whatnot with Socrates. Eventually made the Master Archon went to speak with Socrates. Also, there is, as a reference to the finality of human life here, it's evanescence, the queer status of souls in the natural physical world. So, as both main characters here, Socrates and Theaetetus, are at the brink of the end of their lives, it's a bit of an allusion to human lives in general. We all have our days very short, probably more shorter than we like to think. And the opportunity for us to practice good and philosophy and whatnot is also conditioned and constrained. And so even more the reason to not detour or deviate ourselves from the practice of good and virtue, since our existence is so limited. I see this maybe as a kind of an inspiration later on for the Stoics, who would be big on this. Socrates thinks of human beings as being a soul occupying a body, and the souls go round and round in the cycles of birth and reincarnation. So Vedic Hindu philosophy here to the max. Various bodies come and go. This suggests to us why he doesn't think much of the physical world and thinks that the world of the soul and the mind is more important. Also, Plato implicitly argues that sophistry comes from an ontological doctrine spawned by the new Ionian physics, especially the constant flux of the universe. He kind of portrays Heraclitus here as a caricature guy who only talks about flux, and we know not that it is not entirely the case. This also ends in an impasse or aporia. And the dialogue starts with Socrates being introduced to this young boy in his deathbed by his tutor Theodorus. In this the dialogue, Socrates uses two visual metaphors to attempt to explain how knowledge works. The first one is that the soul is like a wax tablet that was commonly used in ancient Greece for writing, and that the soul is an aviary where birds represent bits of knowledge. And Theaetetus, Socrates' main interlocutor, he earnestly tries to pursue truth. So he's a good fellow who doesn't need much therapy in a sense, like the other guys in the Gorgias, because he was educated by Theodorus, a mathematician, who gave him a good quality education. Has recently been wounded in battle, caught dysentery, and is about to die. This boy starts with the response that knowledge is nothing but perception, which might be a nod to Protagoras. In the end, Socrates says he must go to the chief archon's office to answer some of these charges being preferred by him, as I mentioned. And that is pretty much it. That's what I have gathered from this dialogue.
Yeah, so first of all, the picture you have there for us is a great illustration of what a class character Socrates was, going to visit a young man who's on his deathbed and engaging in the time classic Greek occupation of toe wrestling.
Yeah. This was the best that the AI spat out in the time I had.
Okay. Either that or the young soldier was not dying from dysentery at all, but dying from an infection due to an inconceived surgical joining at the toes with Socrates.
Perhaps.
So the thing that stood out to me in the Theaetetus was the conversation about relativism. And there's some senses in which I do consider myself a bit of a relativist, so the conversation is a little frustrating. And when we started the stream, I sort of alluded to saying that it does seem like framing everything in terms of belief and knowledge and truth seems to be problematic in a way that goes away if you introduce the notion of preferences and desires, and but they don't do that. So it's really difficult to not get frustrated seeing them get into troubles that go away easily if it's the issues are reframed only slightly. And so I've in the past mostly considered relativism in the context of ethics, but in recent years I've more and more moved towards a pragmatic epistemology too. And pragmatism, of course, requires this notion of utility or usefulness, which then harkens back to questions of value and ethics. And so I think earlier when we talked about Protagoras, and he features in this conversation, this man is the measure of all things, of the things that they are, the things that are that they are, and things that are not that they're not. I was thinking that actually applies to different ontological systems as well. And I've used the examples a couple of times of sort of an accounting ontology or a physics ontology or a folk psychological ontology being useful for different things. So you make assumptions about things that exist in those different ontologies. And really you can have preferences over those ontologies for different reasons. And so in this conversation, I think, I don't know if it's in the dialogue itself or if it's more Peterson's example of temperature, where people might have preferences for different temperatures and not too much to be gained by arguing whose preference is correct or whose preference is true. You could just say person A prefers colder and person B prefers warmer, and that's it. That's what there is to say about that. Similarly, for different people, for the businessman and accounting, they may prefer accounting ontology over particle physics, and a physicist may prefer particle physics ontology over accounting, and maybe not too much to gain about arguing whose ontology is correct. And I guess that extends to religions too. And I don't want to say too many kind things to religions because I have very ambivalent feelings towards religion. But there are some religions that appear to be fairly consistent in teaching something like virtue, or adherents of the religion seem to turn out better people than people if you just randomly select from the population. And in order to get there, they employ certain ontologies that, as a scientist, you may say, well, there's no evidence for that ontology. But if perhaps if the utility thereafter is to build community and to cultivate virtue, then we may say, well, their ontology is useful for building community and cultivating virtue, and physics not so useful for that. So not too much to gain in arguing about which ontology is the correct one. And I think it's very difficult in general to argue against that position. Whereas in this, and it's a very relativistic position at the end of the day. It's like a pragmatic ontological relativism, I think, would be a description for it. Although if you Google pragmatic ontological relativism, I don't think you'd get much interesting coming up.
Maybe you're the first.
But it's, I don't know how much different it is from Protagoras. Like just going, because we don't have that much surviving of Protagoras, but going off of a quote like "Man is the measure of things, of the things that they are, and the things that they aren't." That does sound like an ontological thing more than a values thing. So like as a pragmatist regarding ontological systems, it seems to make sense to me, and it seems just from the way things are framed here that Plato is trying to use Socrates to refute relativism. He's not making it look flattering. He's not being flattering towards relativism, and at the end of the day, even really trying, he struggles to decisively refute relativism. Sorry, that was quite a long little rant.
No, it's okay. Graham,
Yeah.
would you like to chime in?
Yeah, no, I was going to say Nerdalliun is like you can solve that by going with absolute relativism, where now you're going the full Epimenides. It's you're basing it on an inherent contradiction. So yeah, no, it's again, this just strikes me out the writer in Plato here, where he's using the parallels between Socrates and the youth. And again, that's where as a writer you use that to create this interference pattern where you end up sending meaning and message in your stories that you don't have contained otherwise. And the ending of I'm just going to go get my lethal wound coming up here at the end of that one is just, again, example of just what a strong actual just pure writer Plato was. And throw the philosophy in on top. You can see why they were entertained back then. Tag.
Yeah. I would also like to take advantage of the context of the subject of the dialogue to address this relativism with the example of temperature with my current personal experience, which is more or less a year ago. I started taking cold showers as a daily practice. And I noticed throughout time that my tolerance to temperature changes increased. I no longer need to dress up when the temperature drops a bit or take off clothes, etc. And I think this is explainable physiologically because when we are exposing ourselves to cold showers, we are kind of training our body physiologically and also neurologically to adjust to turn on the furnaces of the mitochondria and even multiply them in the muscle fibers. The kind of and also the brown fat where the mitochondria that produce heat are stored. It's almost all only their sole purpose, and also the body kind of adapts throughout time with better quality subdermal fat, and also the adaptation of the circulatory system. When a cold stimulus is felt, the blood vessels tighten up at the surface of the skin to prevent heat loss, and vice versa. They also dilate to help lose heat when we are feeling a warmer temperature. And so what this produced in my life experience is that I'm very tolerant with whatever settings at work in the AC are input by my colleagues, whether they turn it on or off or whatnot. I just give them a carte blanche, more or less, and they are much more intolerant to even half degree changes to the temperature. but I don't argue with them like Peter Adamson's example, where he portrays parents typically arguing with children, in which the parents say in the mornings that they need to dress up because it's cold outside, and the children say they don't feel cold, and there's even a kind of a very big conflict between them because of this, parents and their children. And so if people want to know if there is a kind of a fix for us to be more temperate and more tolerant of external adversities, they can always learn a bit of ancient philosophy, which was where I learned about the Stoics, who introduced me to cold showers and other practices, like becoming more and more acquainted with our ephemerality and mortality, which in a sense are potentially the things that disturb us the most. There are people that are so relatively disturbed by the notion of death that they try to hide it with sense pleasure and other distractions on a daily basis, which ends up costing a lot of money to them, and even might cost them their health, as people use the numbing capacities of drugs like alcohol and even opioids to think less of negative thoughts. And I'd argue that most negative thoughts are traceable to people not having a good relationship with their mortality. And so, although people are relatively speaking, people can change themselves.
Yeah, so I think people can transform in ways that go far beyond just learning knowledge or recollecting knowledge from their eternal past. And yeah, that's one way. Like there are interventions that I believe change the functioning of mitochondria, sort of have quite systemic changes throughout the body, and there are changes people can do to facilitate changes in their gut bacteria, which changes the way they process food. And so we can quite literally change our bodies in ways that change what is good for us and what is bad for us. So one person may be able to eat 10 donuts and not be okay with that, and another person will go into a diabetic coma if they're trying to eat 10 donuts. And so 10 donuts really devastatingly bad for the diabetic, but if a person would heal from diabetes and their body would change, they could handle 10 donuts no problem. And
but disclaimer: don't eat 10 donuts. Don't eat them. At least not in the same week.
If there's a mini donuts, 10 donuts. Yeah, and that's actually like a point to that I think Heraclitus also made it, but Protagoras also made it. So for the donkey, like rubbish and like rotten fruit is worth more than gold, and for people, gold is very worth a lot. So what's more valuable, the gold or the rubbish? Or you could say like for the diabetic, the 10 donuts is poison, and for the non-diabetic, it's just it made them feel a little nauseous, but otherwise it's not a poison. And so it's like gold's worthless for the donkey, but really worth a lot for me. I think Protagoras has a point to say like there may not be a final fact of the matter how much gold is worth for both me and the donkey. And yeah, I think this idea that we can, so the point you made is we can change our bodies to change what is good for us in some ways, and we can also grow as people to change our preferences. And I think it's in Aristotle, it's quite clear that over time, the character development constitutes in learning to do what's virtuous because you want to do what's virtuous, because you find a pleasure in doing what's virtuous. So the vicious person is seeking pleasure and does so successfully in ways that are vicious. And there's a transformation that's possible from vicious to virtuous, where one no longer derives pleasure from doing what's vicious, one derives pleasure from what's doing virtuous. And so it's not It's not an act of willpower of forcing yourself to do what's right, even though you prefer to do otherwise. It's preferring to do what's right for right's sake. And I think it's very confusing to label that kind of preference a kind of knowledge, similarly to how like the changes in the body that happens when your metabolism changes from diabetic to not diabetic, or in the case of your example with the cold tolerance, those are real changes like in your person, because you're constituted by your body in large part. So you're changing as a person, but it's not knowledge. And so I think there's some important additional things into like growing into a better person than just learning a knowledge. And yeah, I think following Socrates and considering virtue as entirely constituted by just knowledge can be quite unhelpful.
Since you mentioned knowledge, so this was the last dialogue, and things are kind of nuanced. What is knowledge in ancient Greece? But justifiably, because we can, for example, have a smoker that smokes every single day, but also works in a research institute with the very cancer cells that his tobacco might cause him. Small lung cancer cells that are the most deadliest form of cancer that exists. And I witnessed that. I once went to a conference to an institute here where they do both conferences and have research teams. And I saw the cancer researchers smoking at the door of the building. So they do have knowledge of how molecularly the molecules in the tobacco cause cancer, but they haven't transformed that knowledge in something actionable in their own lives. It's like they are kind of a natural philosopher by day, but they are a hedonist when they are not on the job, which is in complete contrast with how Socrates is portrayed by Xenophon and Plato. Socrates is a full-time thinker. He doesn't just do this on his work hours for money. He does this as a way of life. And so this might distinguish the techne, which is these scientists have the techne of processing lung cells and figuring and explaining why they have cancer and treating them or figuring out ways to treat, but they don't have the gnosis. They haven't yet incorporated in their own being in a more deeper level, maybe in a deeper form of mind, these truths of the association with a habit, a daily habit, which is smoking, in relationship with an untimely and undesirable suffer-ridden death. There's even a concept that I found that goes even further than gnosis, which is epignosis, using the famous Greek suffix of higher or above. Epignosis, exact or full knowledge. This is, I think, what the philosopher should think of as kind of like the target. Even though our ship will never reach that harbor, at least it might be like a point for aligning the compass. And then there is episteme, which maybe relates to the map in which we are traveling. And then Sophia, which maybe basically the same thing as epignosis, or it might relate more to competence and intelligence and thinking rather than specific bits of information called knowledge. And yeah, this is knowledge according to the ancient Greeks. So what do you guys think? Have I missed something out or something like that?
I'm really curious about the specific terms that Socrates used. I've never really seen. So in the specific dialogues, when they talk about knowledge and stuff, which I'm pretty sure they mostly don't talk about techne, but for the rest, I'm guessing mostly is after Sophia, being a friend of Sophia, a philosopher Sophia.
Yeah.
yeah, it would be interesting
Yeah.
to know.
Well, I've been gathering the transcripts of the public domain translations, and alongside, I usually pair different translations to see the differences and whatnot, since I'm not fluent in the original language. But for the case, for instance, of Heraclitus, I've managed to find the original Greek of his fragments and have the original ancient Greek paired with two translations, and so I can kind of get a big picture view of what Heraclitus might have meant, or at least the different interpretations. And I think this would be a worthwhile exercise to do with the Platonic dialogues as well. Even if we don't understand the entire sentences, at least seeing these terms in the text could be quite revealing.
No, I definitely agree. I was going to say, throwing back to the last one of the things I think Protagoras missed is that the person can turn that donkey into gold. So sort of trumps it. And as far as the cancer researchers smoking outside the building, I tend to view that from my economist point of view. For whatever reason, they're finding more utility in the smoking than they would in not smoking. And again, it's a matter of just filling in the reason as to why they find more utility there. Tagging.
You brought an important point, which we didn't mention before, which is Socrates completely this is in disbelief of lack of will. He believes there is no such thing as the Greek word akrasia. He thinks that everyone does what they think is best according to their knowledge, and this fits really nicely with the way you addressed this story I told about the cancer researchers. Yeah, probably they are acting according to what they think is best, or most certainly that's what is happening. They are feeling much relief from smoking between their work periods that might be kind of stressful, and not seeing their perceptions. They are kind of weighing in their perceptions, and they are figuring out this the net value of this utility arithmetic that they are doing, even if subconsciously, and making their decisions based on that. But it only emphasizes even more the importance of realizations, or expanding our knowledge, or expanding our experience. In my workplace, many smokers have stopped smoking with the strategy of reconditioning, which is emphasizing how awesome they are as human beings, while putting down the smokes, the cigarettes, as much as possible. And I think this helps change the arithmetic result.
Yeah, so I've been reading a book on neuroeconomics, trying to understand the way value and utility, as conceived of by economists, may or may not be computed in the brain. And short answer is it's complicated. And there are several areas that do appear to be computing something like a univariate utility function, at least in very simple experiments, for over the alternatives presented. But subcortically, it seems there are several different kinds of reward systems, so that this univariate utility function is somehow an integration over different instinctual needs, instinctual desires. And there's some good experiments showing that states can be induced that change the priorities between different needs. And from experience, it's easy enough to know that in some kind of mental states, we prefer different things. So being full energy, wide awake and alert, and feeling good about ourselves in the world and looking forward to the future and whatever, it may be fairly easy to put down a cigarette while giving myself a pep talk like, no, I'm going to be a better person. that equation inside the brain changes when a person is really tired or really hungry or really frustrated in some one way or another, or really emotional, and the priorities among the instinctual needs can change drastically, and so people can flip-flop over the period of a day, have different preferences, and so people tend to show what appear to be quite erratic behavior if you assume they had a stable utility function. If you try to derive that stable utility function, you'd have a difficult time. But at least in very short-term economic experiments, there do seem to be utility functions. So yeah, I guess you could say, like in the context of a very simple economic experiment where people get to choose A or B, they do what they think is best always, and so there's no sense in saying that they're choosing against their best will. Although sometimes people have about things, and I know from experience that if I feel enough of an ambivalence either way, I may sometimes just choose what, at least at a conscious level, I perceive to be random. Sometimes I just to convince myself it's random, I will flip a coin or I'll throw a dice or whatever, use a random generating device, just to free myself of the burden of reconciling conflicting desires. And in Christian philosophy, it's a big deal. Like Augustine made a big deal about conflicting desires and pulling people in different directions. And yeah, I think there's just more than enough examples in my own life and just in the sciences of decision making and psychology in general, that people do have and can have conflicting desires, and those conflicting desires can make people choose things that if you spoke to them, if Socrates spoke to them, they would tell Socrates why they did was the wrong thing. They would say, like, see, you know it's the wrong thing, but yet they did the wrong thing. In fact, they may have a conversation with Socrates, agree with Socrates this is the wrong thing, and then after the conversation go ahead and do the wrong thing. And I think even in the dialogues there's hints that kind of thing happens. Socrates has conversations with people, intending them to show them that the pursuit of knowledge is the best of lives, and then they kind of get to a point where kind of agree, they kind of see the point, and then they go off and do something else. So yeah. So.
Or like Callicles, who Socrates managed to convince that not all pleasures are good, and then he kind of was at a moment convinced, but then he went back. He took away the words that he said. So it shows, I think, inner conflict. It shows that the person has some inner conflict. And when we are engaging with someone that has an inner conflict, it means usually that they have a metaphysics that has is self-contradictory. The sophist does not agree with the sophist, as Michael Segru famously says, and I think it's really amusing, because, for instance, when talking with someone that espouses kind of extremist beliefs, on which happened to me online, someone saying that their big nation has the power to invade and oppress other nations, and even put people they consider are not so well with their minds in labor camps. This prompted me to ask him how his metaphysics stands on its own. So I asked him, well, what if another really much more powerfulest nation invaded your own, and they considered you not good with your mind and put you into a labor camp? Would you want that? Well, if he was really into it, if he was really into his metaphysics, he would say, yes, I want that, because I thoroughly believe that this is the way things should be, and this is the way things are. This is the law of nature, etc., etc. Which was kind of like Callicles. Callicles went fully into this. He it's kind of like a code of honor or something like that. But this guy, he responded to me, no. He wouldn't want to be enslaved into a labor camp. And so, even though I didn't say anything to him, I didn't tell him what is best in this interaction. I didn't say that democracy is the best thing, that oligarchy or whatnot, or monarchy is the best, or whatever, or a constitution, etc. I just prompted him to think about this, that he was kind of espousing this belief, and also kind of regurgitating this belief online to many other persons that might be young people, impressionable young people that might go on with this. And so in a sense, although Plato's characters might be caricatures of real people, these guys that are self-contradictory are pretty much available today for us to practice dialectic, and we might even do some good while we are asking them tough questions, while being kind of sensible with them, because they are possibly self-contradictory and prone to frustration and aggression. So we kind of need to have an awareness of where they are, so that we can engage productively with whatever persons, even people like Theaetetus, who is earnestly and curiously pursuing wisdom and virtue. So yeah, this, I think, is a way to say that the dialectic is pretty much alive, and the Socratic method can be employed online, offline, nowadays.
No, I definitely agree. It's like basically you were holding up a mirror to his metaphysics and trying to apply some symmetry to it. And the ones that I personally find are dangerous are the ones that whose response are going to be, there's no way my country isn't the greatest one. If there's another one, go ahead and bring it on. We'll just defeat them and then oppress them. You know, those are the truly, it's like, I don't know what to do with those people. On the other side, you know, the thought that occurs to me is they need one of these AIs to basically be Socrates, where it doesn't answer questions, it asks them of you. Tagging on that.
Yeah.
I think some of the language models can be prompted to respond like Socrates and ask Socratic questions. I don't know how good they are. I've never tried it, but I know people have done that, reported.
Yeah.
It kind of works.
For sure, when such model can be trained with the Socratic dialogues, if not much more philosophy, and then kind of imitate the style of the literary style. Literally, basically, that's what it does. So yeah, it's. I think the prompting of AI systems is the bottleneck. If we are extremely creative with our prompting and whatnot, we can kind of coerce the AI to produce really, truly interesting things. Unlike the pictures I showed today. There's also a final set of slides, no less than questions. So these were the questions that stood out to me while Peter Adamson was engaging in dialect with M. McCabe in the last episode covered here. I think it was the 23rd episode. So the first question was, am I sitting on a chair right now? Can I know that? So basically, really basic, down-to-earth stuff, notions that are related to the physical world. Then, what does it feel like to know something? So is there more to knowing than just the vocabulary, language, and symbols? Is wisdom the one thing that is good by itself? What is knowledge about? Is it about something real? How can one know that one is ignorant regarding something? Aporia, we already have the answer. Is knowing that we know what we know essentially for virtue? Can we have an epistemology from Plato without the theory of forms? So these were the questions that stood out to me. I was really perplexed with their conversation because probably it helped me confront with my own ignorance.
Yeah, so not too sure how you want me to respond now. Would you like me to give brief answers to these questions? Just maybe say which ones stand out to me.
yeah, maybe say which ones stand out. Maybe not doing a systematic overview, because we are almost 3 hours in this thing. This is the last longest one. Plato, damn you.
Yeah, it's been a long one. I just focus on the first one. I think before I could possibly answer whether I'm sitting in a chair right now, it would be essential for me to be able to give unproblematic definitions of sitting and chairs, and probably most difficult right now. And I'm not sure I can give like airtight definitions of those things. So I, I, I think aporia is the right attitude about whether I'm sitting in this chair. Um, I think it can be known by gods who have the ability to give perfect definitions, but by mere mortals, maybe not.
Yeah.
In case it's not true, I'm being ironic and mocking Socrates a little bit.
My kind of way to address that, if I may, is to we can feel by several senses, and as best as we can, we should employ our senses, especially using more than one sense to sense a different object or a different action that we are doing. And if there is some inconsistency between them, something might be wrong. But if all the senses are kind of saying the same thing, it feels like you're sitting. The temperature of the chair seems like the temperature a chair would have. If you put your hand on the chair, the hand also confirms what the rest of your body, your back and your butt is feeling. If you look down, you can see the chair. If you sniff the chair, it might even smell like your chair, but that's going maybe too far. It's kind of like the story of the elephant and the blind sages, that the elephant is the reality and the blind sages are the senses, and the senses need to collaborate with each other. Otherwise, we are more or less lost. We can only have kind of surface level perceptions of each individual sense that might not necessarily be true, because we might be looking at something that is giving us an optical illusion. And imagine a 3D optical illusion. You walk up to it and you see, and you touch it, and you see that the thing is fooling your eyes with perspective. But because you moved there and you walked up to that thing, you could feel it from a different perspective, and with other senses, even with your sense of touch. And so I could never, I think, emphasize too much the technique of using sensory synergism to verify and assess things. Of course, this is not 100% accurate or reliable, but it's way more reliable than just looking at the thing and deciding that it's that is that, and your eyes aren't fooling you. So that's one of those things. Graham, you're quiet all of the sudden.
Oh, I was letting you guys go at it. No, what all this jumps out at me is I'm struck by that philosopher leapfrog relay race here, where pretty much all of the questions here is pretty much exactly what Aristotle ends up wrestling with. And, he tries to put answer to all of these questions later on. And again, you can tell that they were, teacher-student, where it's like, okay, this is knowledge as far as I can take it. And then Aristotle picks up the ball and runs with it from there. Going to tag on that.
Yeah. Just going to comment, I missed out like two of the things I would have to be able to define that are like really interesting things to have discussion about. So am is a conjugate of the English word being, so I'd have to give a metaphysical account of being. And I refers to my soul, so I'd have to give a metaphysical account of souls too. So I could only, according to Socrates, only know if I'm sitting on a chair if I could give unproblematic, perfect accounts of being, of souls, of sitting, chairs, and the current moment right now. Which are all really difficult to give unproblematic metaphysical accounts of. So, yeah. I'd also like the second to last question is knowing that we know what we know essential for virtue. I think for specific virtues, it's definitely not essential. So at least in the general case, I think people can be virtuous without knowing that they know what they know. So I think people can be courageous, and that doesn't have too much to do with knowing that they know what they know. People can be kind and generous, all kinds of virtuous without that, at least in my understanding of the word virtue. So yeah, but I think I've kind of made that point several times, so I won't elaborate now.
I also think that maybe emphasizing the importance of knowing what we know, doesn't that kind of lead to a slippery slope in which we also need to know that we know what we know, etc., etc., and it's recursive. So it's kind of strange, right? So for instance, the example of you know what the color red is, but you also know that you know what the color red is, and you also know that you know that you know what the color red is, and etc., etc., etc. So it does not compute. It's a how do you say it in the computer terms? It's like an open loop or whatnot, a closed loop or
I think you're going for infinite loop.
yeah, infinite loop. Yeah.
You're hitting the church Turing thesis with stoppable programming. This is a program that doesn't stop. Tag.
Yeah, it gets quite complicated. I think we're going too far afield with this, but in game theory, some of the proofs require an assumption of common knowledge of the game, which is knowing the rules of the game and knowing my options and knowing the other person's options and knowing that I know that and knowing that the other player knows that and knowing that the other player knows that I know that they know and knowing that I know, but knowing that I know that they know that I know that they know and knowing recursive back and forth.
Yeah, and if the two players are extremely elite skillful and both have equivalent skills, the guy that usually wins is the guy that goes further in that scale of knowing that we know that we know that you know that the other guy. So the guy that is one step ahead of the second guessing kind of game, that is a meta game in all games. After the skills are put to the side because everyone is very skillful.
Yeah, so in some of the proofs, the assumption is both people go down that road infinitely, and makes the proof simpler. Sometimes crazy assumptions do make proof simpler. In some really interesting cognitive science work, Josh Tenenbaum has a computational model of how people actually do that, because in reality, people can't go down that rabbit hole infinitely. So he has this this model where different people go into that recursive modeling at different steps, and he's pretty good at predicting behavior in certain kinds of collaborative games. And yeah, there's also some interesting empirical work to measure sort of in the context of a given game, what's the average level of depth that people engage in that reasoning in. I think it's K-level reasoning in behavioral game theory. So like K-level reasoning wasn't originated by Josh Tenenbaum, but he sort of built on that idea with a specific computational model for a specific game. Anyway, that's way off topic, guys. Maybe we should
finish this thing because we need our energy, because we will still face more Plato in the next episodes, but we will get in due time to Aristotle, and I can feel that Gram Pong is excited to reach Aristotle. It's quite apparent.
I was going to say this is your slugger's row. You know, you got Socrates, Plato, then Aristotle, and each of them would just build upon the other. And it's again one of the beauties of Western philosophy.
Yeah,
I am also very, very keen for Aristotle. Big fan.
Yeah. Too, likewise. So let's end this thing with a little playful animation. So there we have Socrates in the streets of Athens. There he goes. To be continued. I'll be back.
Actually, the first image you showed of him, I thought he looked really good. Like he had a really good figure, and he looked
Yeah.
a little bit like Marx to it. And if you can come back to the very first slide.
Yeah. This one.
No, like in the slide number 1, not slide number 31. There he has a bit of a bladder belly. It looks a bit.
Slide number 1, like
Yeah.
this one.
Yeah, you see there. That's like fit Marx. That's not Socrates.
Yeah, well, the AI isn't useful for producing consistent characters.
That was the younger Socrates. You could tell because the beard was still dark.
Yeah, exactly.
What this scene needs is it needs that really cute boy on the right-hand side of the screen that then exits, and then Socrates goes after him.
Yeah, right, let's go. Any charming young boys there, and he
and that smile on his face is perfect for that too.
Yeah. Well, I was going.
The glowing cheeks and everything. Yeah.
I was going for an image that Marcus Aurelius gave me, which is Socrates swaggering throughout the streets of Athens, and this was the best thing that the AI could give me. Yeah. So.
All right. Thank you both for joining. Thanks to our audience, and see you guys next time.
See you guys.
See ya.